Bibi went to Jordan to speak to the king of Jordan. Now, this is very important. What does Harabayas mean to anybody else? Really, Harabayas shouldn't have much significance to anybody who's not Jewish. But as you know, a number of crusades and holy wars have been fought over the years, not among Jews, by the way, between Muslims and Christians and different groups among Muslims and Christians for control of so-called holy city. Now, I'll have to admit, in Crusader times, the point was just getting Jerusalem, not because it was about the Temple Mount per se, but it was Jerusalem because that was the place of Jesus's ministry. That's what makes it holy. That's where the Holy Sepulchre is. So to them, the Christians see the holiness of Jerusalem something entirely different than as us. And the Muslims didn't necessarily hold of Jerusalem as a specifically holy place. Rather, it was just part of their empires. You know, you can't give any inch to the heathens, the heretics, the kuffar, or what's the word? The infidels who come from overseas to try to conquer. So it wasn't necessarily about Harabayas, although there was the Templars. Remember who were the Templars? There was a knighthood, an order that of crusaders who did control the Temple Mount for a while. That's why they're called the Templars. So they did have some significance to this, but they ascribed some significance, but it wasn't necessarily about Harabayas. In the modern era, the king of Jordan, his grandfather, the first king of Jordan, basically created this whole Temple Mount as they should trademark it, the third holiest place in Islam. Why the third? Because it used to be this Hashemite dynasty that now reigns in Jordan, which is a fabricated state like most things are nowadays. There was no independent Jordanian people in Jordan itself. As we said previously, used to be called Transjordanian Palestine, the part of Palestine that's on the other side of the Jordan River. So the Jordanians, the Hashemites, basically lost control of the real Muslim holy cities, Mecca and Medina. Mecca being the holiest, Medina being the number 2, I guess, but that's actually based on, classical Islam. That goes back to, Muhammad's time. That's the beginning of Islam. So the Hashemites ruled there for time immemorial. They even say that the current king is a descendant of Muhammad. Okay, that could very well be, but that's not the point. The point is, because of British politics and the British owing something to Ibn Saud, helping him foment revolt in the Arabian Peninsula against the Ottomans, helping the British take down the Ottoman Empire. So they owed Ibn Saud big time. So they made him king in Mecca and Medina and basically pushed out the Hashemites. So the Hashemites were given Amman, and they were also given the eastern part of Palestine. Instead of calling it Transjordanian Palestine, just call it Transjordan. Yeah. So they had to give him something, and it was barely anything, but he had to build it up for his own pride. So he created this whole thing that the next holy site is Jerusalem, and it's I guess it was Hashem's kindness to him that he actually allowed, he with a capital H, allowed the Jordanian legions it's a singular, to conquer basically the old city of Jerusalem in the War of Independence, and basically turn the Temple Mount into what it is today, and install the Waqf and all that. That's why the Jordanians still run the Waqf. And it was the king of Jordan, as we said, who basically put on the golden part of the Dome of the Rock. Yeah. It's ironic because he put it there like right before the 6-Day War. So the Jordanians, it's part of their pride that they still control the Temple Mount. They still have the Waqf there. And whatever silly status quo agreements that may have existed and still exist today are basically made with the Jordanians. They're the ones who are enforcing this. Why? Because it's their personal pride. Now, why should any Israeli prime minister care? Why should it even matter to him? I do not know, but like I said before, could be there's some Yitzhak horror reason that Bibi and all the prime ministers come into here. They're like, yeah, that has to be something. We don't want to have hostilities with Jordan. They're depending too much on Jordan for what? Oil? Technology? Some sort of import? Is Jordan giving Israel anything? Does Jordan hold any cards? I don't know what. But there's something that, or just, I guess they were the first ones to have a real peace treaty with Israel, not the Egyptians. A real peaceful peace treaty with someone. Who knows, for whatever reason, and perhaps one of my more politically savvy viewers can tell me why, that they agree, basically, maintain the status quo is a bone that they give to the Jordanians. It's not because of the Palestinian Authority. It's not because the Egyptians are demanding it. It's not because the Saudis are demanding it. The Saudis couldn't care less. They control the they control the real holy places. And it's not all those places, the Gulf states, that are busy making peace with Israel. They acknowledge, it's a Jewish holy place. So for whatever reason, that's what they do. And I hope that eventually we break out of this thing, because the status quo is not particularly sacred. There is no reason, the status quo. So that brings me to something that Rabbi Meir Soloveichik wrote recently this week. Rabbi Meir Soloveichik, that is Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik's great nephew. He's the son of Rabbi Elio Soloveichik, who's the Rosh Kollel in New York, where I was studying. And although I was close to Rabbi Soloveitchik's younger son, I was his chavrusa, I don't believe I've met Rabbi Meir Soloveichik, who's become quite a mover and shaker in his own right the last 20 years. This Rabbi Soloveichik was even a candidate for the chief rabbinate in England after Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Mervis, I think, took over. Rabbi Mervis was the better choice in this regard for the British, because he himself is actually British. He was also older and more experienced. So Rabbi Soloveitchik was the underdog. So it's not such a terrible thing that he himself wasn't chosen. Maybe they'll pick him in the next round. But for now he has a nice pulpit in Manhattan. He's also involved in some YU things, and he writes an article occasionally. And that's why I wanted to bring this up. He wrote about this, that basically he wrote about Moshe Dayan and the current status quo. I'll read you some things he wrote. I thought it was very nice, and I have a question about this. He wrote, "We are thus in an Orwellian moment in which the status quo is whatever Jordan might consider it to be, and in which the history of the Temple Mount can be redefined the moment in order to disregard the rights of a Jewish state, the most important site in Jewish history." Rabbi Soloveitchik pointed out, there are people saying that Ben Gvir broke the status quo. The bad guys are saying that. And what's the status quo? That Jews can walk on the Temple Mount? That's actually one of the things that at least Moshe Dayan, I say Yamach Shemo, I say, I don't know. He was a real Russia. He fought wars for the Jews and cared about the Jewish people, but he did all the big three sins. He didn't worship idols. He just denied God very specifically. Okay, but he did Gila Rayos and Shvichus Damim and theft and all those things. He's a very difficult person in history. So he says that they keep redefining the status quo. The current contretemps, I don't know what that means, like all others concerning the Temple Mount, reveals that Dayan's original decision was a terrible mistake, the worst in Israel's history. Yes, I was telling people that years ago when I first began to think about these things. I considered what Moshe Dayan did. I remember reading about it in the Jewish press. I said it's as though the Maccabees on day 3 went back into the temple, blew out the candles, so as not to offend the Greeks and the Hellenists, and then departed, saying, we don't want to provoke our enemies too much. Rather than pacifying Jewish-Muslim relations, the Dayan compromise instead encouraged Israel's enemies to deny any Jewish rights of access to the Mount. The general's decree was not only strategically misguided, but also terribly unjust, as it has created a situation in which the only faith community in Israel that cannot fully access its most sacred site is made up of religious Jews. One can be a fierce critic of Ben Gvir or any other leader in the current government and still understand there's something profoundly wrong with the current situation. Yaakov Katz of the Jerusalem Post stated the matter succinctly. Why is Israel under threat from a terrorist group for allowing Jews to pray at Judaism's holiest site? Why is it okay for everyone else to pray there and not for Jews? And why do these Palestinian groups get away with making such threats? It's a good question. I wonder if Rabbi Soloveitchik himself has been to Har-Bayis. And then David Horowitz, who's the editor, used to be of the Jerusalem Post, now of the so-called Slimes of Israel, said, there's an argument to be made for permitting wider access and the right to pray for Jews at the site of the biblical temples. In part, this argument charges that Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, electing not to fully realize Israel's sovereignty over the Mount immediately after its breathtaking capture in the 1967 war, helped facilitate the resonant Palestinian lie that the Jews have no connection to our ancient homeland. For surely if the Temple Mount was historically ours, religiously ours, we would not have handed it back to them. Dayan self-evidently thought otherwise. Anxious to avoid a full-on confrontation with the entire Muslim world and utilizing the halachic argument that Jews should not set foot on the Mount for fear of defiling the sacred ground where the temple, its holy of holies, once stood, he allowed Jordan's Muslim Waqf to continue to administer the compound's holy places. That's a good argument. People see that. People say Moshe Dayan is right. Secular people say this. Your biggest rabbis say it's forbidden. The problem is basically stemming from the rabbis. Moshe Dayan was basically following the status quo religiously. Like I said, nowadays also, that's why you don't see an Israeli prime minister or president go to Har Bayis. If you have someone who's sympathetic to religion, it's usually the Haredi, the mainstream Haredi imagination of Judaism, which doesn't have any place for this. So here's Rav Soloveitchik's kasha. Horowitz's account leaves out the fact that the decision of the ardently secular Dayan was founded on total disregard for what the Temple Mount meant to religious Jews. That's true. Total disregard. Doesn't really care. He said, the Vatican? We don't need this. After his paratroopers broke through Jordanian lines in 1967 and reached the site, Mata Gur exultantly exclaimed that Temple Mount is in our hands. I'm having a hard time with my throat. Dayan, in contrast, infamously reflected, what do I need this Vatican for? As the Israeli journalist Nadav Shorgai has documented, Dayan's actions are based in the presumption that the Temple Mount is not of any religious significance to Jews at all. Dayan's decision did indeed facilitate Palestinian claims, rampant today, that no temple ever stood in Jerusalem, that the entire Jewish connection to Jerusalem is a fabrication. This is why more and more religious Jews are realizing that visiting the site is essential. Yes, we have to go back and lay claim. Basically, if saying that we're not going to go there, we're basically giving up on it. It is not only far-right figures who are visiting the Mount. Entering certain sections of the Mount in a manner sanctioned by Jewish law is becoming more and more mainstream among Orthodox Jews. And that is why opposition to Jewish access to the Mount is growing more and more frantic by the day. Because we're finally realizing that we shouldn't go the way there. I wonder what Rabbi Soloveichik and Rabbi Avi Shafran would do if they would sit down at the table to discuss this. Rabbi Soloveichik is not, I don't think, he's not a spokesman for the RCA or the OU or any rabbinic organization necessarily. But what he's saying is against what the Aguda spokesman is saying. Rabbi Soloveichik concludes, perhaps when it comes to the history of the democratic liberties of mankind in the eyes of those who piously intone on the subject, it is only the rights of religious Jews that do not matter. So this is an argument we already criticized. Dr. England also said this. It's like, yeah, we deserve religious freedom there also. I don't want the Temple Mount to be run in a manner that is, let's say, secular, left, classically liberal, Western. We want to limit everybody's access to the site. We want to put the Levim in charge there. We want to make it that only the Kohanim can do certain things there. So making this argument that, freedom of religion and all that, that's a little bit disingenuous. Okay? But more importantly, Jews are waking up to the fact that 65 years of dead end, this is my own words, halachic policy, dead end halachic policy is holding Am Yisrael back from keeping the Torah.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.